So I understand we actually have an owner this year.
We do. Is Mr. Borg here? Come forward, please. Welcome.
Yes, thank you for having me. This is my first time here before the Rent Guidelines Board. In prior years, I understand that this sector has not been represented. My background is I'm a real estate attorney, and I also have an interest in an SRO, equity interested in SRO. I'm pretty familiar with the sector. And a lot of the larger hotels, especially on the west side, which were the SROs everybody knows about, over the years converted to legal, maybe semi-legal transient hotel operations. Don't hear me? I'm sorry. And I think that the stories you hear about with this hotel having 4 permanent residents and that hotel having 7 permanent residents, and they're just running traditional transient tourist hotels right now. So I don't think there's been the industry is really, that portion of the industry was not interested in, what's taking place with respect to the handful of the permanent tenants in the properties. I'm here instead on behalf of SRO owners that are operating legally with permanent stabilized or rent-controlled tenants that are not advertising on B&B and that don't have websites for tourist-style operations that are really, come for 30 days and then you move out after a week. Just running plain rent-stabilized properties. Those rent-stabilized properties are generally in buildings that are older, and their cost structures and their operations are very similar to those of the pre-1947 apartment stock here in New York City. For whatever reason, over the last years, the Rent Guidelines Board has decided that, except for 3 specific years where there were increases permitted with the proviso that the tenant reps talked about, to give a 0% increase. Now, from an owner perspective, I can tell you that if you have an SRO and year after year you're going to get a 0% increase, you should not be surprised that the result from the owner community is going to be warehousing, looking for government contracts, looking for colleges. If you would have had the same policy towards the apartment owners, that sector of the market, you'd see the same thing. Owners, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If you have years and years of 0% increases, your owner population is going to seek another use for that property. Now, many times it turns out to be illegal, like the Imperial Court, like these other properties that are notoriously running illegal transient operations. But many times it'll be illegal. They'll seek out not-for-profits, they'll seek out city contracts, they'll seek out educational institutions. But you should not be surprised that after, let's see, my records, some notes over here showing since 2004, you've only had 3 years where you've allowed increases. So there should be no surprise from tenant reps or from the board that if in 16, 17 years you only allow increases in 3 years, that the owners are running away from this and trying their best to do something else with the property. No surprise whatsoever. In fact, I would be shocked if the vast majority of SRO owners would sit there year after year, get a 0% increase, and not seek to do something else with their property. Some of the SRO owners, have low cost structures for the purchase price of their property, so they can tolerate it a little bit longer. But anyone who's purchased a property more recently, they can't survive this sort of a regulatory scheme. No apartment owner could survive this sort of a regulatory scheme. And yet the board over the years has persisted in treating the 2 types of housing stock differently. Since 2004, I see that the board has granted SRO properties increases in only 3 years. The 1%, the 1-year renewal increases were 9.5% for the SROs, aggregate, in those 3 years. And the same years, 1-year renewals for apartment stock were permitted 29% increases. Now, the cost structure for these properties is more or less the same. I think that if you look at the PIOC studies that the board puts out, and you compare the operating costs, the yearly increases in operating costs for SROs as against those for pre-1947 apartments, the cost percentage increases are almost identical, except in 2 years where the statistics are so far off that I think there was something wrong with them. Maybe a tenth to less than 1% separated the cost increases in SRO operations and apartment operations. Even including this anomaly in the statistics, the cost increases for SROs were 19% and the cost increases for apartments were 34%. This from 2004. So where the apartments had a 34% cost increase, the board allowed, again, just for a 1 year, using the 1 year statistic, a 29% increase. And the SRO owners, where there was a 19%, and that's including the anomaly, which I think is incorrect, and I think the increases were closer to 25 and 30%, the board only approved a 9% increase in 1 year renewals. I don't think there is any justification for treating the two types of housing stock differently. I hear from the tenant reps that this population is more vulnerable. Yes, in nominal terms, it's more vulnerable. We're dealing with people who make less money probably than their cohort in the apartment properties. But again, on an absolute basis, the rents in these properties are lower as well. I think the denial of resources to the property owners to maintain the properties is not the right answer. I don't know what the correct answer is to solve affordability in New York, but denial of resources doesn't help. We see with the New York City Housing Authority that's been denied resources all the years, and the end result is a housing stock which is now in crisis. Just as an aside, if any private owners had done what the management of the New York City Housing Authority had done, there would be a hue and cry all over this town. There's an intent to discriminate against the SRO owners that are operating legally. I don't know why. I think they're caught up in what the tenant reps refer to, all these illegal activities, B&B and warehousing. But a lot of this takes place in the apartment stock as well. There are many B&B units that are full-blown apartments, and yet we hear that it's the SRO owners that are all at fault. In prior years, the proviso that the tenant reps referred to was included whenever the board granted an increase, and I think that's not a bad idea. There should be an attempt, because of what's going on in the market and the perceived abuses, for the board to distinguish between SRO owners, hotel owners that are operating legally, and those that are not operating legally. And between the Airbnb, the illegal hotels on the websites, and all of that, if someone is running a property and generating heavy profits from those operations, so maybe there's some rationale in not giving the owner an increase for his SRO stabilized units. But if someone is attempting to comply with the law, and then he finds that he's granted 0% increase year after year after year, at some point he's going to wake up and say, hey, you know, I'm being pretty stupid. Let me just warehouse my units, find some not-for-profit that wants them, give them to the homeless people on a city contract where I get a hell of a lot more, find a college that wants the units, and no one should be surprised when that happens. No one should be surprised when that happens. With respect to any specific proposal, I think the board should permit an increase to SRO unit owners on new leases. They should permit a vacancy increase. They should recognize the fact that the two types of housing where operated legally are basically the same and basically should be treated similarly. And the disparate treatment, which has been the mark of the board for so many years, should stop. That's really all I have to say. In terms of any specific percentage increases, it's very hard because the disparate treatment and the discrimination has gone on for so long. It's hard to know what is fair to bring SRO unit owners back to some sort of parity with their counterparts in the apartment world. But I think that as a policy matter, SRO unit owners and hotel unit owners that are operating legally should be treated the same way that apartment owners that are operating legally should be treated from now on. Questions?
Any questions for Mr. Borg?
Do you want to go? Oh.
Yeah, well, you go ahead.
Mr. Borg, so this is only my second year on the board, but as noted, there has been no representatives of SRO owners in the past, and the tenant representatives have provided us a fair amount of data about vacancies and other issues with this class of buildings. So I guess one question I have is, do we have any data, or can you provide any data about buildings that are operated, as you say, legally, predominantly as a traditional SRO? And a related question is, what proviso would you recommend that the board consider in terms of buildings that, what percentage of occupancy is appropriate to give a increase to versus not give an increase to because of the way they're being operated?
I don't have any specific data. I don't know that anybody has been able to study the different types of SROs and break out those that have substantial non-traditional housing income from those that have traditional housing. I don't know of any such studies. But if you have an SRO building, it's got 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 units. Generally, these smaller units, as the tenants describe them, they're single rooms, maybe public kitchens, public bathrooms, or maybe the room's got small kitchenettes in them. It varies all over the lot. The operations are the same as a traditional apartment building, if not greater, because public bathrooms and kitchens have to be cleaned on a regular basis, which you don't have in your apartment properties. More units means more cleaning, means more work, more repairs. It's just, if anything, the expenses are a little bit greater. It varies, of course. Some of the old SROs still are maintaining some types of hotel services. Some of them never did. Some of them, over the years, have done away with the services. I don't have any specific data, but I could tell you from buildings that I'm involved in that if you're running a traditional property and you're not running a transient operation at the side, it's the same sorts of expenses. Your heating, your electrical, your real estate taxes are going up no matter what. That's your biggest increase year to year.
Would you be willing to share any information about the SRO that you have a financial interest in, or some that you've represented as an attorney? Just kind of size, vacancy, what percentage are what we're calling traditional SRO tenants?
I'll go to the second question. Instead of focusing on personal experience and personal clients, I can't discuss client data, obviously. The past years, the board proviso was set 80 to 85%, and some years it was 80, some years it was 85%. I don't think that's a problem. If someone's renting 85% of their units to permanent stabilized tenants, then they should be treated as a regular apartment building. Over the years, you always have, a certain number of units that are vacant, even in your apartment properties. Sometimes the SRO units turn over more rapidly because they're smaller units, but an 85% threshold is, I think, is a valid test for an owner that is operating properly within the law.
Thank you.
It's a test that I would have no problem with.
Scott?
I just want to understand. So when an SRO becomes a city property, or when a city takes the property, are those rent-stabilized tenants?
No.
once they're used for other purpose, the rents can be readjusted and charged, whatever the agreement is.
About is agreements between the landlord and, it's just like the SRO shelters sites. So the tenants don't actually, we argue that the tenants should be considered rent stabilized if they live there past, for a rent stabilized tenant, 30 days, for SRO tenants, 6 months. But that isn't like what they have rights to. They are at the will of HRA or whoever's placing them in that unit.
Yeah.
And so if they, for some reason, you know, someone makes a complaint or no longer qualify, they get removed from that. They have no rights to that apartment.
Got it.
That's generally what I understand to be the situation. If a not-for-profit comes along and wants to rent 10, 20 rooms, and they have a program that they're operating with any one of the various agencies.
And can, just for my benefit, can you just explain the example of institutions, universities, and colleges taking over SROs?
It varies all over the lot, from shelter use, not-for-profits that are providing substance abuse, spousal abuse, drug abuse, depending on, there are a myriad of government programs that require residents, and, you know, depending on the program, various programs can go into mixed-use buildings, some of them prefer not to, and obviously the more units that an owner can give to a not-for-profit that's willing to run an agency, run a program, the more profit he would make. And, you know, from an owner's perspective, if, you know, there's an agency that wants to take 20 units off his hand, 10 units, 20 units, when the other alternative is to rent them without a vacancy increase and without a percentage increase, you know, don't be surprised when you see the result. Especially after you've done this for 10 years in a row, when you bang on someone's head with a hammer after a while, there's going to be a hole there.
Any other questions for Mr. Borg? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. One quick comment. So we were talking about the vote on Thursday. If you follow the preliminary, the boilerplate language I sent around, you simply see where the blanks are. That's what we're considering. So if you want to propose something, just fill in those blanks. So it would be the 1 and 2 year guidelines for apartments, 1 and 2 year guidelines for lofts, and a special guideline. We have to promulgate those in the apartment order. In the hotel order, we have to set adjustments for those 5 different categories of hotels. They're just 1 year adjustments. There's no 2 year leases for hotels. So if you go through that boilerplate language, you'll see where the blanks are.
And there's no vacancy we don't set the vacancy for
We
the
have
SROs.
not set the vacancy. There is a space for it, but we have always just deferred to the law, state law, and there's language in the current order that we can certainly put in there. And so that's how we've treated it since vacancy has been taken over by the state. And there is a sublet allowance this board has done for many years, but it's not obligated under law to set a sublet allowance. But that language is in there also, if you choose to do that. So, but anyway, use it as a guide. Any questions, please don't hesitate. Pick up the phone and call somebody other than me. No, just give me a call. It's fine. Oh yeah, it's on our website, but I can send it around. If you just go to the hotel, if you go to the guideline section of our new website, there's an apartment and hotels. There's the whole chart is there, but I will send around the link so people can take a look at both if they want.
I make a motion to adjourn.
We are adjourned.